so we can unmask ourselves now. It is a very great pleasure to have Clarice Assad and David Skidmore here. These are, as you saw, two elements of the collective performance and composition of this series of pieces. I'd like to just start out by asking a little bit about the composition process and how composition seems to have graded into performance, right? What the relative parts of those two aspects were. And first, let's talk about the number 12. Right? 12 it's a very meaningful number for people in music, in this tradition anyway, right? It's the tones and semitones. It's a calendrical number. There are lots of things that make us think of 12 as being somehow a complete cycle. Did you begin work on this series of pieces knowing that there would be 12 subparts, or did that emerge along the way? What came first? How did it start?
Well, I think you started this, right? I feel like you came to us with the idea that it would be 12. Is that true?
I think so. I thought it was a very reasonable number because considering how many archetypes there are, right? I wanted to stay realistic in that sense, because we could have easily written for thousands of them. I think we were too excited.
Yeah. And then starting with whichever piece you began with, there seems to have been a kind of a process of addition or accretion, right? I don't know whose pieces began. Was it you, Clarice, who first started writing them, or was it Sérgio Assad, your father, or how did the number 12, how did the constellation finally coalesce?
I think, what happened was that I was really obsessed with Third Coast to begin with. And,
as many of us are.
Yes, and I just saw them live once, and I thought, I'm gonna play with them someday. But if you have to come up with an idea that's worth really pursuing, these guys are extremely busy. They're doing so many projects, and that was a thing I wanted to do also with my father. And we were talking about a theme, and my father came up with the idea of myths and legends. And of course, we were from Brazil, so we're thinking about myths and legends from Brazil. And like, nobody knows these characters. These stories are close to our hearts because we are from Brazil. But maybe, David, Peter, Sean, and they're not going to know that. They're not going to connect with that. What about archetypes, right? I mean, that's how the story came to be. And we approached these guys with the idea that the two of us, my father and I, would be writing the music. However, and that's my favorite thing to say, because I'm so excited that once we got together for the first time and talked about the project and the possibilities of how it was going to come to be, they said, we want to write music for it too. So that's even more interesting, in my opinion.
Yeah. As somebody who's watched a number of performances by Third Coast, I can testify as a member of the audience that there is a really eerie degree of synchronization and sort of mutual thought that seems to be going on in the different brains of the people there, which must mean that there has been tremendous preparation and forethought, and maybe some improvisation. I wonder, David, if you could tell us a little bit about how the ensemble works in improvisation or suggestions, or starts with a melodic line and elaborates on it. How does that process work with you?
Well, the four of us are fortunate to do Third Coast as a full-time endeavor, and so we play music together, 5 days minimum a week, sometimes more. And that began for us actually as a very much in the classical Western tradition, a through composed, read music off of a stand sort of way of working. And improvisation has slowly crept its way into our music making, as composition has. And actually that was one aspect of this project that was so amazing for us, because Clarice is this incredible improviser, and Sergio as well. And I think one of the first questions you asked us is, do we improvise? And we basically said, not like you, no. Maybe on a drum set where you can't hit any wrong notes, technically. But we did stretch ourselves a little bit. I mean, we could have probably been a little bit braver, but most of what you see in this performance is that we play is through composed. You and Sergio sort of improvise solos at certain points. But, you know, like I said, the four of us play music together all the time, so that's a great thrill and privilege. But my colleagues are all here, and I think they would all agree with me that it's also a thrill to have new voices in the room with us. And typically for us, that means one thing or the other, a guest performer or a guest composer, and to have both at the same time was incredibly fun and inspirational.
And that, you know, even if it's through composed, you have the feeling when listening to these pieces that you don't know which way it could go from one measure to the next, right? So you might have written it all in advance, but it has that improvisatory feel to it. And each piece also has its own character. Some of them are rhythmically very intense, and others of them have a harmonic aura. There are questions about pace and tonality and the timbre of the different instruments. It really reminds me of what Aristotle said about music, forgive me, down at the University of Chicago. When we can't think of what to say, we always ask for Aristotle. And Aristotle says that music is the art that is a mimesis, an imitation, not of things, not of actions, but of states of mind. And I think that's a very intelligent and wise definition, because it's not asking music to be scene painting or necessarily drama, but this idea of reflecting states of mind also happens to fit pretty well, I think, with the program of this piece. How did you start? Did you start from a title or from a story, from an image? You know, what was the seed for each of these different pieces, Clarice? You know?
Well, I think at first I looked at the ones that I resonated most with, and well, of course, one of them I really resonated with, so much that I snatched it before everybody else did. There was the jester, like, oh, that's me. And but you know, pretty much because we started off with the idea that just the two of us would write music, my father and I. And by the time we heard from them that they wanted to write music as well, there weren't that many like options left, because we had already started writing the music. You know what I mean? My father had already written a lot of notes. He loves to write a lot of notes.
Yeah.
And, you know, so it became also an idea of what do you really relate to the most at this point, you know? I think, right? Because you said The Lover was something that spoke to you, right?
Yeah, I definitely, that was the piece that I wrote, and I had a very specific idea of what I wanted, how that title could fit with a musical idea that I had in my head. But I will say that the simple genius of the idea that you and your dad came up with is that music really is amazing at evoking, and I think that ties sort of to what your buddy Aristotle said, which I love. You know, music can tell a narrative if it's helped out by a text. But even in cases like musicals or opera or pop songs, if you strip away the words, or if it's sung in a language you don't know, and you just ask anyone what it's about, they might come up with something that is incorrect in the sense that it doesn't match up with what the composers or the creators came up with, but the amazing thing is that it is relevant to them. And this project is like that, because I wrote a piece called The Lover, and it has its own ideas behind it. but none of you know what those ideas are, and so you may have heard it and thought of it as, and heard something else in it that I didn't intend, but is just as meaningful as what I wanted to say. And that's the amazing thing about music, and the amazing thing about this project is that you could have written the lover and it would have sounded different than mine. I could have written the hero and it would have sounded different than yours. And so these archetypes are universal, and they are incredibly evocative. And as a composer, they're an amazing starting point, because you're not starting from nothing, which is the terrifying thing about writing music. Yeah. Someone says, "Write me a piece," and they don't tell you what it's for. You just sort of start shaking because it could be anything, and that's like staring into the abyss. But if someone says, "I'll write a piece called The Hero," you know, there's just so many different ideas that can percolate, and yet it's not so constrictive that it limits your creativity.
Yeah. I hope we'll be hearing the Jester in the second half.
It leads off the second half.
Yeah,
and it's fun.
Yeah,
that was definitely the most fun of the 12. Some of them were fun because they were challenging. The Jester's just fun.
Yeah. Well, one kind of duality that I see in hearing these pieces again and again is between the rebel, which you start out with, right? It's a very energetic, driven kind of piece, and you feel the impatience of the rebel to tear everything down and start again, versus on the other end of the spectrum, the ruler, where there's not very much melodic or rhythmic pushing. It's, these very stately harmonies, like, a ruler in solemn procession advancing down a hallway, and it's a very secure sort of piece. There's not a lot of dissonance there, right? And so rebel and ruler are, at two ends of the rainbow that you're drawing here. And of course, it wouldn't be complete if it was missing either one, but it's astonishing how you've been able to make both of those positions seem real for the duration of each piece.
And that's also because I wrote one and Peter wrote the other one.
But I'm taking you as collective authors.
Yes. But you know what? The thing is, I would never have come up with that at all, ever. From the harmonic changes to that incredible use of the fans, which the first time I saw that I was like, whoa, that's amazing. I could never have come up with that idea. So that's one of the reasons why I'm so grateful we all wrote this set together.
Yeah, and I'm having a completely irrelevant, but I'm using free association. About maybe 30 years ago at the Metropolitan Opera, they did a production of Handel's Circe, where the characters on stage all had big black fans that they flapped open and shut periodically with during the performance. So it was as if I was seeing that all over again. Yeah. Well, great. Why don't we pick up again then after we've played the second half? And I have some other questions that have to do with your sense of what archetypes are, what the freedom of movement is within an archetypal kind of structure, and sort of what options people would want to exert on interpreting archetypes today as opposed to almost 100 years ago when Carl Gustav Jung kind of drew up his table of archetypes. So maybe we can come back to that after the second half.
Perfect.
Great.
Thank you, Haun.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
We're not done. All right. Well, I thought we might continue with a little bit with some thoughts about archetypes. I've had this question that I've been wanting to ask you because I've always been a little bit uneasy in my mind with the idea of archetypes. I have trouble differentiating them from stereotypes, right? And in part, I think this is because of the way that Jung's work on archetypes has been made familiar in America through people like Joseph Campbell, who tended to reduce the idea to a kind of a monomyth of, the male hero who is born and develops and confronts challenges and triumphs and so on and so on. This doesn't leave a whole lot of room for other kinds of stories. And I was intrigued when I saw your program notes that you had chosen non-gendered words like ruler and caregiver, for example, right? Roles into which people of either gender could fit themselves, which is a departure from kind of the classic idea of archetype as stereotype. And then I started to think, well, music is all about transposition and permutation and variation. And it might be that music is exactly what the notion of archetype needs to correct it away from this tendency to sort of posit strict models that must be followed before they're seen as important, right? So I don't know if this was at all part of your thought process as you were working through the idea, or not.
I'll say that resonates with me a lot because, for instance, the piece that I wrote, which was called The Lover, I deliberately had both in mind a stereotype of what I thought that could mean, and what I wanted to write, which was very different from that. And I think that, I feel like there's almost like a fun exercise here, like we could have picked the 12 archetypes and not named them on the screen and asked all of you to write in which you thought each one was. Maybe we'll do that next time we play it live. And some of them, you might get, and some of them your neighbor would get that you didn't get, and all that sort of stuff. And it matters and it doesn't matter. But I'll say that I came at this project as a complete novice in terms of the deeper study of archetypes and Carl Jung's work. And when we got into it, I started to do real, I wouldn't even call it like armchair, study.
We got some nice armchairs here. We can get started.
I know. I wish I had had this chair. I was probably, not in an armchair. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I did like a little bit of look into Carl Jung's work, but what immediately became interesting to me was that what you're talking about, these things these words have baggage, but that this project was an interesting opportunity to either lean into a more like whatever the idea was we originally have about these words, or to challenge it a little bit. And I think that each of us did that to varying degrees with each of the pieces.
I agree.
And it was really good to be able to see you on screen, because you could see the process of simultaneous invention and composition and so on, particularly with the Jester. You were totally challenging Bugs Bunny, replacing Leopold Stokowski with your directions to the different musicians and your challenges to them.
That's true. And when we do it live, we also invite the audience to be part of the orchestra. So it's even more fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that is absolutely the spirit of the Jester. And in fact, the way you start with the jaw harp and the sticks, right? These are poor man's music, right? This is what you have when you don't have any other instruments. And you built some structures out of them and then brought in other people using also kind of improbable instruments, something like a duck call, right?
That's on them. I think everyone should go into your studio one time in their lifetimes, It's so much fun. So many things that you would never imagine, like the Creator that Sean wrote. My God, those sounds, I never even knew they existed,
Well, that's a feeling that we often have when we hear Third Coast Percussion. Right? We didn't know those sounds existed, and these people produced them. And so in that way, too, I was kind of trying to mark one scale of difference between the rebel and the ruler, but also between the jester and some of the other more opulent pieces, right? You've got a kind of a play with means that are going to be used. And so, again, as I was saying earlier, each piece has such a personality of its own and such a thought process of its own that it's really very enriching to listen to them again and again. One other question about the allusions to other music. I mean, are you aware? Do you think of this as you look at your own compositions? Do you say, aha, here's a little reminiscence of this thing or that thing, or this instrument choice connotes this or that to me?
I think so. In this case, with Third Coast, what happened was that my initial thought was to go there with as little as possible, for us to actually work on deciding collectively what sounds to use, because we really did want every piece to be as different as possible, even in the instrumentation. So I can't take the credit for it, saying like I sat there and imagined all these sounds in my mind. That is not true. Yeah. What I came in with a framework to develop as a group, and I think that's also why it is so special, that it has everyone's opinions and thoughts put into it.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And only just add that the same is true for Third Coast writing for you and your dad, because we sort of also approached this project as a cool opportunity to write. I know for myself, for the first time for classical guitar, and for me it was the first time for piano, and basically to say, okay,
you did great.
First time I ever get to write for classical guitar, I get to write for Sérgio Assad. That's not intimidating at all. So we sort of sheepishly walked in the first day and just said, this is what I wrote. Now, let me preface it by saying that you are a great guitar player, you are a great pianist, you're great at everything, so just make me sound good. But I'm kidding, but actually what we're talking about is Third Coast's favorite way to work is to get in the room with creative people and say, well, here's what we have to offer, and vice versa. When we're writing for other people, to say, again, here's what we have to offer, but bring all of your musicianship and your knowledge of your instrument as well, and in the end, the piece will be better for it, rather than, speaking of like stereotypes, the stereotype of the composer, sitting in their room, waiting for a higher power to whisper in their ear and have the thought travel down their arm and into their quill pen. It's not, that's not the way the best music is made, as far as we can tell. It's getting in the room with, bringing ideas that one comes up with, but then saying, what can you bring to it?
Now I want to write an album called Stereotypes.
Please do. That will be your easy listening album.
That's the sequel.
That's right, yeah.
It's your fault.
Well, I can recommend to everybody as an exercise that you get Clarice's other music and Third Coast Percussion's other music, and then having listened to those, listen again to these pieces and see how they blend and modify each other in the creation of these pieces. One last thing, I want to talk about the guitar, because I think it's got a very unusual position at the middle of almost each of these pieces, and providing a kind of continuity that in tone that you don't get with many of particularly the percussive instruments, right? Because with percussion, it's there's an attack and a delay and so on, and the guitar seems more conversational in a way, right? So in a way, it's at the center, but it's unlike everything else going on around it, I would think. What do you think about that?
That's interesting. One of the many things that I learned from this project was just looking at how Sérgio writes as a guitar player, because he a lot of what I experienced of his writing was linear. One note follows the other, a single note, but it was creating harmonic information that was moving in really cool and unpredictable ways. And we're all shaped by the instruments that we know when we're writing music. And with each of Sergio's pieces, there's just these incredibly fast and incredibly difficult to play musical lines that sort of thread through the ensemble. And I love how he kind of makes us, in my mind, he makes us guitar players in his pieces in such interesting ways. It's also just, it's such a beautiful instrument that has so much, so many different personalities to it. I mean, I grew up listening to people playing power chords, with like heavily distorted,
Yeah, I didn't notice any wah-wah pedals.
Yeah,
today.
we left the wah-wah pedals out. And so it's just amazing to have been in the room with your dad and hearing just the incredible sounds he gets. Like just using this part of your finger instead of that part of your finger, and it changes everything. Yeah, it was a real education.
Yeah, and even visually watching this film, you see that he's the center, he's the pivot around which everyone else is rotating in this little universe that you've built up. Is that fair to say, you think, Clarice? Yeah.
Yes, and in fact, his wife, Angela, she's an astrophysicist, and when she saw us on stage, she was like, "Oh my God, you're like the sun, and the planets are revolving around you."
That wasn't intentional, but I like that. I like that image.
Wonderful. Well, without the sun, where would we be, right?
Exactly.
No solar system, no photosynthesis. We could go on down the list. So I want to thank you all for bringing these planets together around the sun, achieving the photosynthesis that you've done, and I look forward to more music from both sides of this conversation.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here.